What is the strangest movie you've ever seen? There can be several ways in which this question can be interpreted. One of the obvious interpretations is of the content of the film itself, where the style, writing, structure, or even acting becomes so utterly confusing it can overwhelm the viewer with the unusual and bewildering imagery witnessed. A far less frequent type of strangeness would be involving the context of said movie. An example of this could be discovering an obscure, lesser-known or low-budget film created or starring well-known figures. This involuntarily provides the viewer with a strange outlook onto the film, as the people residing within the movie creates an aura of strangeness and discomfort as it melds familiarity and unfamiliarity into one setting. A film that merges both of these aspects of discomfort from absurdity to create a true cinematic oddity will be that of Death Proof. Before we analyze the theme, story, and consequences of Death Proof, we must first understand the context in which it was created. Death Proof is the sixth movie Quentin Tarantino has directed. It was released in the year of 2007 as part of his Grindhouse project. Now, many are not familiar with Death Proof or Grindhouse, especially outside of the United States, as there was never a theatrical release of Grindhouse outside of the US. This has been a major factor in making Death Proof one of Tarantino's far more obscure works, as it has a very limited release even within the United States and has only become available on some streaming services in the past few years. In order to explain why Death Proof has remained a relatively unknown and ignored entity within Tarantino's filmography, we must first understand the concept behind Death Proof and Grindhouse as a whole. Grindhouse was a project created by directors Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez. This was alongside Edgar Wright, Rob Zombie, Eli Roth, and Jason Eisner. The usage of Grindhouse for this project derives from the term coined in the 1970s to describe cinemas in urban areas that typically show low-budget, low-quality, and oftentimes exploitative films. A common feature of these Grindhouses was that of the double feature. This was a concept in which a Grindhouse ticket would pay for the viewing of two films in one session rather than paying for one individual viewing. This was done because of the fact that these Grindhouse cinemas were typically in decline within working class areas who would be unable to pay for cinema tickets regularly. This was especially given the economic decline experienced in the 1970s, which Grindhouse cinema would have first started to appear. This created a rising niche in cinemas for cheap, easily produced movies to be sold in a literal two for the price of one deal. This was seen as valuable and enjoyable for many, as not only were you seeing two movies for the price of one, but also many of these films would feature predominantly black casts, which would not be a common feature of many mainstream Hollywood movies at that time. These would become known as blaxploitation films and became a very well-known subgenre of exploitation films seen in grindhouses. Another aspect that would attract people to grindhouses was the contents of the movies themselves. Because of the inherent nature of cheap exploitative movies, it meant there was far less regulations and restrictions before a film was permitted. This also allowed for the creation of movies that you would never see in mainstream cinema. Many horror and gore subgenres such as giallo and mondo films thrived in the grindhouse scene. There are a vast amount of types and categories of exploitation films found in grindhouse due to the vast number of exploitative movies made during this time. For Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino, the exploitative double feature to be found in grindhouses were a source of nostalgia, as they would have seen many of these films growing up. After various annual home screenings of double features that Tarantino would host that Rodriguez would attend, they began to discuss the creation of a project which celebrates and parodies the long-gone grindhouse double features. This is the context as to how Death Proof was created. Death Proof was one of the two films created for the Grindhouse project. The other film featured within the Grindhouse project was that of Planet Terror, directed by Robert Rodriguez. Together, these two films will be combined into one double feature showing across the United States in honor of the dead exploitation genres of old. Understanding the background and context for the creation of Death Proof is crucial to the understanding and enjoying of the film, as it relies on your knowledge of low-quality exploitation films. Death Proof is a twist and simultaneous parody of generic car chase movies and shocking horror flicks that were rampant in this era of cinema. Every detail of Death Proof is made in such a way to reflect and represent the style and features of an old era of cinema. An obvious example of this care to detail would be that of the camera quality. In the first half of the film, the quality is consistently grainy and features rather saturated coloration alongside black spots and awkward movements to replicate the oftentimes poor care and poor preservation common with these movies.
Oh my god. Hey, this is Mark and I's UT days are new. Hey, you want to join us?
For a second, but I'll miss some friends. Oh. So you must be.
Judging from my description alone, it could be misinterpreted that Tarantino's direction and my description of Death Proof could be that of mockery. I'd wholeheartedly disagree with this sentiment and believe as often as there can be a thin line between mockery and admiration through parody. It may be hard to quantify as it is a rather subjective matter, but an argument I would use to demonstrate the difference between mockery and admiration is of the effort given and the respect displayed. A parody mocking the common tropes and taking humor through ridiculous caricatures of a genre or a movie can be through just admiration through the level of effort the film takes into recreating the original medium, even into its minor details. A parody that seeks to derive humor from insulting and denigrating the source material while using minimal effort is mocking the source, as it does not respect it, nor does it show admiration, as it does not want to put the effort into creating a genuine replica to parody. Death Proof demonstrates Tarantino's personal admiration and respect for the genre of cinema he had grown up with and reminisces fondly upon. This can be shown through the effort Tarantino had gone through to recreate the look, feel, and storyline of an exploitative grindhouse film, even into its smallest details. An example of these small details that add to a surreal, cheap feel would be that of the opening. Death Proof begins with a rather unusual opening. Despite the fact it was released in 2007, it feels old, grainy, and worn, as it recreates how many grindhouse films would begin. Even the title card's quick cutaway portrays the image that this is a different movie, relabeled and retitled, as many of these exploitative films were to make a quick profit. The uniqueness and strangeness of the opening title sequence of this movie can be seen as quite confusing and bizarre for viewers unaware of the background or context of Death Proof. This experience is what happened to me, as I had no knowledge of Death Proof before viewing the movie. But it is not hard to quickly figure out what Tarantino was trying to communicate in this movie: the joy of watching a bad movie. Death Proof is a film that attempts to recapture the feeling and aesthetics of old, bad, yet fun movies. It is by no means an obscure niche with the popularity of movies such as The Room, Manos, The Hands of Fate, and Troll 2, in which people will intentionally watch horrendously incompetent movies as the poor quality and strangeness creates humor and confusion for the viewer. It is possible to receive humor from these objectively bad movies, as shows such as Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Red Letter Media's Best of the Worst demonstrate. But what I would argue is that in some instances, such as seen within Death Proof, Tarantino does derive humor from these poorly made movies. But it is not the crux of what makes Death Proof. With some of these terrible movies, it is possible to receive genuine entertainment and enjoyment from these objectively poorly constructed movies. After all, it isn't too common you take ideas from a source and show how much they've influenced you without a little bit of enjoyment from the initial source. This is how Death Proof displays itself in a truly unique fashion. It takes humor in the poor quality of grindhouse movies, but it doesn't focus on it. Death Proof is a movie that both parodies cheesy movies, but It is not afraid to take itself seriously and reveal a truly gritting and horrifying edge. What I would argue is that Death Proof is much like any Tarantino movie. It is just Death Proof is such an extreme. The reason for the radicalness of Death Proof is because it is very obviously a pure vision. It is the pure embodiment of what Tarantino's views on cinema are, and in a way, is a very personal creation. Death Proof's concept may not be relatable to most people, and it isn't designed to be. It is a pure and unfiltered reflection of Tarantino's views on cinema in the past and now. It is very obvious that Tarantino is very passionate about film. It is clear in every interview I have viewed that his knowledge collected about cinema and effort put into creating cinema is from his unstoppable love for the medium in all its forms.
Now, what should we know about film preservation? Why is it important?
Well, it's important because, film preservation is our heritage. I mean, film is the art form of the 20th century, and it's being lost.
Tarantino loves to put references or ideas from his movies he has seen in his life into his own creations. A perfect example of Tarantino's love of old references in cinema can be seen with Tarantino's casting choices in his various movies. A common thread of Tarantino's movies is casting actors who Tarantino would have grown up remembering in their prime 20 years ago, and their stardom has slowly faded with time. For example, Harvey Keitel in both Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs. Despite Keitel's appearance in critically acclaimed films such as Mean Streets and Taxi Driver, Keitel was most often remembered by his performances in Tarantino's first two productions nearly 30 years later, despite being in numerous films directed by Martin Scorsese.
Julia, Winston Wolfe.
Yeah?
You were on your way to Marcia's hen party when you took a hit from a couple of wise guys.
Nightmare.
About your car. Does it smoke? Make a noise?
Yeah.
Call Direct Line. They'll arrange a hire car.
Won't have to wait for mine to go in for repair.
Not with Direct Line.
Oh,
What about us?
Are you with Direct Line?
No.
Then on your bike, Buster.
Other notable examples of Tarantino's love for traditional and older cinemas could be in the previously mentioned Pulp Fiction, in which one of the main characters, Vincent Vega, is played by John Travolta. Tarantino is often credited for single-handedly reviving John Travolta's career after his initial decline throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Even though Travolta made his initial stardom following the success of Saturday Night Fever in 1977, one of his most famous roles would be that of Vincent Vega in Pulp Fiction. He is oftentimes remembered for his improvisational performances of famous dances from the 1960s such as The Twist and The Hitchhiker, in the famous diner scene in Pulp Fiction. A particular relevant display of Tarantino incorporating an older and traditional celebrity that he grew up with, watching on television and in movies, will be that of Kurt Russell. Kurt Russell has been in numerous famous roles throughout cinema and television, which has cemented his role in pop culture and his stardom. And one of the reasons why Tarantino had cast Kurt Russell in Death Proof is because he felt Kurt Russell in some ways had lost his edge that he used to have in movies such as Big Trouble in Little China and The Thing. Tarantino believed that people had forgotten how Kurt Russell used to be, in his words, a badass when he was younger. Tarantino's references to a gone era of cinema and his love for old cinema goes down to even the casting choices. Kurt Russell in Death Proof plays one of the main characters within the movie, known only as Stuntman Mike.
I'm not a cowboy, Pam. I'm a stuntman.
Much like the theme and casting of Death Proof involving a bygone era of a long since past, the character of Stuntman Mike plays into this. Much like many of Tarantino's earlier works, despite the style and aesthetics intentionally designed to look like the past, it is not set in the past. So even though Death Proof looks and acts like it is from the 1970s, it is set when it was released, 2007. Stuntman Mike is very obviously supposed to be an aging and increasingly irrelevant stuntman. Kurt Russell's character is involved in a dying industry with nowhere to go. It is implied he's lost employment over the advent of new technology. Whether it is through green screens, computer-generated graphics, it doesn't matter. The advent of a new style and way to produce movies has left stuntmen and other practical effects to be left to the wayside of the past. As you may have guessed, nostalgia and reminiscing about a golden age is a core aspect of this movie. The character of Stuntman Mike isn't necessarily a nobody, as he has gotten employment as a stuntman in the past for decently notable roles in television shows. But semi-notable television roles nearly 30 years ago doesn't mean people will remember you.
Do you know any of these shows or people I'm talking about?
Sorry. No.
And it demonstrates this in the movie, where nobody knows who he is and nobody cares. Ironically, the movie is named after Stuntman Mike's car, as it has been fitted to be indestructible from the stuntman's perspective, to prevent damage or death, giving it the name of a death-proof car. Yet, the car of the stuntman is death-proof, but not the job. Tarantino has stated in interviews that everyone in the industry knows someone somewhat similar to Stuntman Mike's character. He believes everyone has their own twist or variation of the character of Stuntman Mike from their past experiences, and Kurt Russell's performance really took the idea of the character to new lengths. What could be said is that in Tarantino's direction, he placed a major twist onto his concept of a has-been stuntman, in the fact that Stuntman Mike takes pleasure in murdering women with his car.
Hey, Pam! Remember when I said this car was death-proof? Well, that wasn't a lie. This car is 100% death-proof. Only to get the benefit of it, honey, you really need to be sitting in my seat.
Obviously, this aspect of Stuntman Mike isn't accurate to the concept of the old has-been stuntman that the cast has seen before. In typical Tarantino fashion, not only does Death Proof feature a shocking twist in relation to the character, but also a reference to the commonly gratuitous violence and gore that was a common sight in grindhouse films. After all, many slasher flicks had their origins in grindhouse, and many horror directors had their start from creating low-budget horror and gore films that would not be available in mainstream cinemas. This is where, as previously mentioned, giallo films came from, as they were exceptionally common in this era, such as Cannibal Holocaust and Salo. These two movies in particular are incredibly well known and controversial over 40 years since their release. This is due to the themes of violence and horror witnessed within these movies. These two specific movies have been banned in several countries to this day. It could be argued that directors like Rodriguez and Tarantino, in their creation of Grindhouse, missed the ability filmmakers had in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s to produce incredibly horrifying and gory movies, as extreme violence are both common features of Planet Terror and Death Proof. There was a sense of liberty and rebellion that directors such as George Romero, Wes Craven, and Lucio Fulci, in which they could produce movies that were on shoestring budgets, which were ridiculed and denounced by the mainstream, but became hugely successful cult classics remaining relevant in horror communities half a century later. I don't believe this detail was lost on either director, as they brought director and musician Rob Zombie to produce a trailer for a fake movie at Grindhouse. Notably, Rob Zombie throughout his work as a musician and director has openly displayed his affection and influence from horror movies from this time period that Grindhouse sought to recreate. The gory violence in extreme and oftentimes fictitious ways is a common feature of Grindhouse films as a whole, and is also a common feature of Tarantino's work as a whole. He has been notoriously criticized for the way he uses violence as a way to communicate themes, characters, or a story throughout his works. What I would argue is that the violence seen particularly in Death Proof, and more broadly his cinematic work as a whole, is harkening back to the violent films he saw in his youth, that he enjoyed and took great influence from. A major factor in die-hard fans of Tarantino's works would be the way Tarantino is able to bring features, references, and styles of niche subgenres or cult movies into critically acclaimed and mainstream movies, which spur influence in their own right. Death Proof is very much one of Tarantino's works through the features, references, and styles of extremely niche subgenres and cult movies, but is commonly regarded as one of his worst films and failed at the box office, leaving it with no mainstream impact and no pop cultural impact that many of his other works have received. The major issue with Death Proof is that it stays far too close to the original material for some people's tastes. This naturally begins alienating possible audiences. This divides many of Tarantino's hardcore fans, as many love Death Proof and many loathe it. For some people, it is too far away from typical films that Tarantino has produced to be enjoyed, so they turn away. For some, they understand the references, but as Death Proof was created to replicate a niche within cinema, it doesn't mean everyone will like it, as not everyone enjoys niche content. The very concept of Grindhouse is niche in its creation, as the average person who watches movies has never seen a Grindhouse film, either due to their uninterest or unawareness. It isn't impossible to breach niche communities into the mainstream inherently. Tarantino has proven himself, alongside the rise of the horror genre, as a Goliath of cinema. I think the issue was that the very idea of Grindhouse was very limiting, as the interest for such a creation was only appetizing for cinephiles and die-hard Tarantino fans. Arguably, it is bewildering to those outside of its possible niche. Unfortunately, the amount of energy, passion, and excitement about this project driven by both Rodriguez and Tarantino created an enormously high expenditure for a relatively strange and niche concept. An example of the passion put into Grindhouse by its two directors will be the previously mentioned fake trailers created by Rob Zombie, Edgar Wright, Eli Roth, and Jason Eisner. There were a total of 5 trailers produced for this, including Rodriguez's own Machete starring Danny Trejo. The next fake trailer were Werewolf Women of the SS, created by Rob Zombie. This features Rob Zombie's wife and Nicolas Cage. Edgar Wright created Don't, featuring Matthew McFadyen, Simon Pegg, and Nick Frost. There was Eli Roth's Thanksgiving, starring himself, and finally, the winner of Rodriguez's Grindhouse trailers contest was Jason Eisner's Hobo with a Shotgun. The reason for why I am mentioning these creations is because of the stars, both directorially and performance-wise, involved in the fake trailers made for Grindhouse demonstrates the effort and the dedication both Rodriguez and Tarantino had into this respective project. They wanted the creation of fake films that don't exist for the sole purpose of being a joke, for their double feature parodying Grindhouse cinema as a whole. This is what connects all of the fake trailers with the films created for Grindhouse. It is meant to recreate the sense, feeling, and style of Grindhouse films, much like Death Proof and Planet Terror. Although, what must be noted is that these projects, obviously from their content and titles alone, are far more comedic in nature than the films produced, and given their nature as trailers, are not able to convey the same looks on such a scale. What must be noted before going ahead is that Machete and A Hobo with a Shotgun became so popular they eventually became fully produced movies in their own right. The failure of Grindhouse and Tarantino's Death Proof not only divided its audience and critics, but also Tarantino himself. For example, the budget of Death Proof was an estimated $30 million US. The box office for Grindhouse as a whole was only $25 million US. And that isn't even including Planet Terror, the fake trailers, and the advertising for the project. Tarantino's next work, in contrast to Death Proof, would make over $300 million US on a budget of $70 million, receiving 6 BAFTA nominations, 8 Oscar nominations, 4 Golden Globe Award nominations, as well as giving Christoph Waltz an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor in 2009. What does Death Proof have in comparison? Tarantino's biggest flop, both critically and at the box office. It is understandable why he regards it as his worst movie. He does not consider it a bad movie, it is just the worst one he has created. It is interesting how differently Tarantino views Death Proof before and after its release, as in numerous interviews alongside behind-the-scenes footage, you can see his pure excitement and enthusiasm to unleash Death Proof into the cinematic circuit. Yet, as previously mentioned, he is highly critical and disapproving of the film after its shocking failure. There are defenders of Death Proof out there. For instance, famed film critic Roger Ebert gave Death Proof 3 out of 4 stars, which is not a bad label from one of the most famous American film critics in history. In my personal opinion, what makes Death Proof a truly enjoyable and intriguing film is the nod to old cinema created in such a unique and detailed way that creates an honestly expressive and personal piece of art that is not reflective to such a degree in any of Tarantino's other works. There is a far more subtle subtext viewable within Death Proof that I would argue is not as existent in some of his other works. A rather strange but nevertheless interesting argument that I have heard argued in conjunction with Death Proof is the use of female protagonists in the film. There have been, very obviously, other female protagonists within Tarantino's films. What makes Death Proof far more unusual is that not only is there 2 sets of female protagonists, but they're also created to display 2 types of protagonists in exploitation films. The first set of protagonists are not designed to be likable or frankly interesting, as they are shown to be in a rather promiscuous and sexualized manner. Unsurprisingly, these were common features of particularly horror films, which frequently showed a feeble damsel unable to escape the clutches and the horror of the killer or the monster within the film. By the halfway point of Death Proof, the entire female cast of protagonists are killed off, and the only thing connecting the first half and the second half of the film is Stuntman Mike, as not only does the first half have a completely different cast of characters, but also a completely different style, look, and music. The second set of female protagonists have a far better cast with far better characters to work with. With that being said, these characters are still inescapable from, shall we say, Tarantino's writing cliches.
Have you let him do anything? Yes. I've let him give me a foot massage.
Regardless of that, what is interesting to note is that much like Stuntman Mike, one of the protagonists played by Zoe Bell is also a stuntman, or rather stuntwoman. An interesting thing to note is that Zoe Bell is a stuntwoman outside of Death Proof and has been a stuntwoman on several of Tarantino's films before Death Proof. Ultimately, this slew of characters are able to defeat and kill Stuntman Mike by the end of the film. The argument in relation to the cast of protagonists is that Stuntman Mike represents the old and dying side of cinema, with his character literally being from an occupation that has been stunted by the advent of computer-generated graphics. But also, Stuntman Mike represents many features of grindhouse cinema, the sexism and the general sexualization of exploitative films and the worthlessness of individuals like Stuntman Mike in the modern film industry. In a way, it culminates into the destruction of the old ways, with the death of Stuntman Mike, as the newer cast who are not prone to the stereotypes and mistakes from an irrelevant past defeat him. In conclusion, Tarantino's Death Proof is an incredibly indicative film of not only the death of grindhouse cinema and the subgenres created within it, but also Tarantino's personal rebellion against modern cinema, alongside his dissatisfaction with the way films are created today. Tarantino's adoration and nostalgia for not only a lost style of cinema, but also a way of thinking and creation that is absent in our modern era. Death Proof, and more broadly, Grindhouse, was created from the influence and admiration Tarantino and many other directors had for a dead medium which lost relevance and viewers with time. Death Proof is a very personal work which is not only reliant on your understanding and knowledge of cinema, but also the director himself. An unusually divisive movie in which not even Tarantino's fans can agree upon, given the nature and the concept of Death Proof, that decides your like or dislike off your knowledge and preferences of both his work and other works. In a way, it could be shown that Death Proof had succeeded in what it achieved to in its extremity and its bizarreness. It is like the grindhouse cinema of the past. It is grotesque, it is hilarious, it is strange, it is weird, it is unusual, it is pulling, it is enjoyable, it is Death Proof. Thanks for watching this video. This is the second video I've actually put together, but there's a good chance by the time you see it, it probably won't be the second one, as I intend to release this much later, so you'll probably see other videos before this is properly released, though. Some people probably see it before then. Yeah, this took me quite a while to make, about slightly over a month, the whole process, like script writing, audio writing, whatever, the whole thing. That took roughly about a month because of, things came up and whatever. But yeah, this audio, this bit of me talking, this was recorded instead of just after the audio recording, after the editing. So unlike last time, I more or less know how this video is going to turn out and what it's like So next time I probably do this to say my thoughts and how it turned out. I'll probably do it after the audio recordings instead, as you get more of a previous perspective rather than just one at the finishing line. So it's, you know, you get far more genuine, or I suppose initial thoughts, which is more interesting, I suppose. But yeah, I feel like I improved a lot more on this video than the previous one due to some minor editing stuff, quotes, being focused more on the topic at hand, as the other one I did kind of talk about Doki Doki a lot rather than the initial topic. But I feel like with this one I had the intention of sticking to the source material more frequently and more reasonably so, and if I did diverge, I didn't diverge very long. So yeah, I hope it turns out well. I made this in anticipation for the 30-year anniversary of Reservoir Dogs. You know, Tarantino officially been making movies for 30 years, and given that he's likely to make his last one soon enough, or have made it by the time this is released, you know, kind of bodes well to regard his weirdest, or by some metrics his worst movie. But you know, certainly still food for thought, and that's, you know, why I made like a half an hour plus video about it. So yeah, I don't know the length of the video yet. I've just pieced it all together, and just after I record this I'll be plumbing it there at the end credits. Yeah, bye.